Kelleher, go ahead.
Thank you. I wish to move Amendment 36, and thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you, Taoiseach, for being here today. Firstly, I would like to recognise the diplomatic efforts underway by you and your department as the Brexit process comes to a conclusion, or does it? It's hard to see any conclusion emerging, but we're doing our bit, and your leadership has been very much in evidence. And I want to say thank you and to say that your work is very appreciated by all of us in the House. The comprehensive and extensive nature of the legislation before us today reflects the seriousness which our preparations for a potential no deal have been taken by government. And I suppose, as somebody who lived in the UK for 17 years, I look on in horror and despair at what's happening, and I hope some sense returns to the body politic in Westminster, where so much work has been done, and good work in the time that I was there, but that's not what we're about today. I'd like to thank you for your engagement with us so far on the topic and this important amendment, and in particular your engagement with my colleague Senator Higgins, who's abroad on business, and I'm a very poor substitute for Alice Mary here today. So, thank you very much. As you recognise, this is an extraordinary piece of emergency legislation preparing for a major geopolitical event outside of our control, and one which yet will have wide-ranging impact on the lives of a great many people in this country, potentially for generations. Its substantial 98 sections amend a total of 37 other pieces of primary legislation across a wide range of policy areas and the remits of 9 different ministers and government departments. In addition to the amendments to primary legislation, a number of the provisions of the bill give wide-ranging powers to ministers, and that's at the heart of this amendment, to issue regulations and statutory instruments to respond to a potentially chaotic no-deal Brexit, in which quick and decisive action may be needed to be taken, and for which statutory flexibility may be required to respond dynamically to the consequences of such an exit as they arise. Due to the wide-ranging number of policy areas in which the European Union has competency over Member States' affairs, it is not surprising that such substantial amendments and regulatory powers have been included by your government in this bill. However, we do feel that the significant changes that will arise as a result of this bill will need to be subject to a higher than usual level of parliamentary scrutiny and review, which is our motivation behind tabling Amendment 36. The amendment would require that within 12 months of the enactment of the legislation, that firstly, the Minister for Foreign Affairs would conduct a review of the Act as a whole, and secondly, that each minister with competency for provisions of this Omnibus bill would review the provisions relating to their own remit. The results of these reviews and conclusions drawn from them would then be laid before the Oireachtas within 6 months. We need to ensure that the provisions of this bill are working as intended, and that ministers are using their regulatory powers that have been extended if this bill is enacted appropriately. I recognise that the Dáil and Seanad standing orders already provide for post-enactment scrutiny reports, but we want to ensure that the post-enactment process for this legislation is comprehensive and robust, as the scrutiny its provisions has received since publication. I welcome, for example, the most relevant Oireachtas committees have met specifically to interrogate its provisions in the light of the tight time constraints, and we want to see that the post-enactment process is just as detailed and conducted sector by sector, department by department, not just by a single minister. And whilst this legislation may be led by the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Minister may not be able to give a proper account of how, for example, the student grant arrangements in Part 5 of the bill are working out, or the social welfare or insolvency provisions in Parts 11 and 12. This is our main motivation for the amendment. Our amendment would simply put a sector-by-sector review conducted by the most relevant and appropriate minister on a statutory footing, and put in place clear time constraints and oversight mechanisms for the wide-ranging provisions of this crucial legislation and the resulting secondary legislation and statutory instruments that will arise from it. It is a reasonable request, one that is fair and, I believe, proportionate to the extraordinary nature of this emergency legislation, and one I hope that you can accept, Tánaiste. Thank you.
Senator Kelleher.